Reminder that we still are taking down names for anyone who will provide a treat, that snack after the meeting. Tonight, we have snacks provided by Pat Blanchard. Thank you, Pat. There is, by the way, one more way for you to show off your baking talents, and that will be for our November 2nd meeting. We have at the table right here a way for you to sign up for November 2nd. And then we also have a way for you to sign up for 2024. So I will remind you if you need to have a reminder about that you made that commitment back in the previous year. So that's taken care of. And also note that the society will be providing cups, plates, napkins, and beverages. So any snack that you might provide, the rest will be taken care of. Coming up on October the 5th, our meeting will be a potluck luncheon, and it will be hosted by my wife Sharon and myself. Hopefully, it will be a cool enough time of the day that we can hold it outside on our patio. We're looking at about 11:30 a.m. Serving, and the entree will be baked French toast. We'll also have some lunch meat, so if you want to bring something for something of that, it's a potluck, so that would be appreciated. If you would please RSVP Sharon or myself, and we'll have the phone numbers in the newsletter, so you can do that. Our November 2nd program will be presented by Michael Seamus. If the name is familiar, Michael was here just over a year ago, and he did a program for us on Tulare Lake. This time he will be here in November with a program on the early Central Valley Native Indians. And it's quite an extensive program also. And so that will be for the month of November, will be our final program of the year. Our speaker tonight joins us from Sacramento via Zoom. Sandra Harris and her husband own a photography studio in the capital city. Sandra is also a member of a Sacramento Genealogy Society. I'm not sure which one, but she can fill us in on that. It was through Sacramento Society that I was able to make tonight's connection. For many people, at least for the generation that was before cell phone cameras, taking photos and stashing them in a drawer was all too common practice. Also all too common, too many of those photos have no kind of notation on the back or front or anything, just who they were for. So it left a lot of us wondering the who, what, when, where's, and whys. So earlier this year, Corky Peterson was here, and she provided us a story and some insight into how a family photo album of her family was found up in Northern California and finally returned to her. So tonight, Sandra Harris will be taking that process of identifying a vintage photo just a little step farther, we hope. So please join me in welcoming Sandra Harris.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you asking me to do this. I hope you will enjoy what I have. I'm a professional photographer. I've been in photography for about 65 years. So I've seen it grow. I was asked by the Genealogical Society in Elk Grove, which is south of me, to do a presentation such as this a couple of years back. Because I was a photographer, they said, you could be able to tell us what pictures were taken when. Well, I don't know. So I went in and I decided I'd try to find out. Well, I found out a whole bunch of things that I thought were really interesting. And I think I can give you some guidelines if you have some pictures that you just aren't quite sure about, or you think you know, but you'd like to have a little bit more documentation for yourself. So I'm going to go through and show you from the very beginnings of photography to what's going on kind of now. Give me a second. I always have problems when I get myself started on share screen. So it is. I knew I'd be in. Come on, go. All right. All right. He did mention when we started out that you might have a box full of photographs. You might have, if you're lucky, an album with photographs in it. Ooh, wow. Or you could just have a big pile of photographs. And there's a picture and you've got this lady and it says mom. Who the heck was she? Who knows? So today I'm going to try and give you some clues that might help you determine when a photograph was taken, when this was taken, when this was taken. I'll be talking especially about this little girl in the moon. I think you'll enjoy where that particular kind of photograph comes from. But let's go on. Let's get a magnifying glass out, get some photograph out, and start to get an idea about where a picture was taken. And I say use a magnifying glass because a lot of times you're going to look at a photograph and you don't see everything. Like this one, I saw that the man over here on my right is holding a dog. I didn't realize there's another dog over on the left and behind the lady with the big hat. There's some things that are of interest to me. The background is interesting. The guy with the blurred face is interesting. All of these can be clues. But let's go on. If you're a detective, you're going to find it's really fun to start to look at photographs and make judgments. So you can ask yourself a question or two. What type of a photograph is it? As photography started, different time periods, different processes. You wouldn't expect to see a picture of a satellite on a tintype. So each time period has its own type of photograph that'll show up, and that'll help you to guide you to what might be a time period. Who is the photographer? And you're going to say, how in the heck do I know? Well, yes, you should know. Professional photographers in 1860 were all over the United States. And they not only were around the United States, they would put their pictures with their names on them and even their city, which would lead you to be able to go to a city directory and get information as to when they were in business. Unfortunately, photographers didn't stay in business very long. So sometimes you'll only find their name in the city directory once. But still, look at the date of the directory. That'll keep you close to the time period that they took that picture. How are the subjects dressed? That's a mixed type of questions because clothing is in the eye of the beholder sometimes. Like in 1840, little kids had off-the-shoulder dresses. Moms had off-the-shoulder dresses. We had hats. We had unique necklines, things that will be of value to you to look at. Look at it all. See what you're seeing. Also, props. Props are used by photographers to do a lot of things, to disguise things sometimes. Furniture, chairs, drapes, floors, all of those things are possible to look at to get clues. And could the photograph be taken on a holiday? If you look around and you see parade signs, sometimes they even have the dates on them. If there's a flag, do you realize that we got our 50th star in 1959? Earlier than that, you'd have flags with less stars. That would give you a clue as to time period. Now, if you have a family group and you're puzzling about who could be in it, you know maybe one of them. Let's say you know the little boy's name and age. Okay, we've got an older person here. Is that his mother or is that his sister? She could be either one, depending on the family size. They could have like a family of 9. She's the oldest daughter, and it goes down the line. So what are you going to do? Check the census close to the photo date. See if you can find him. When you find him at the proper age that you figured he'd be in, whatever, this is 1940, then look and see who the oldest woman is in that picture, excuse me, in that census. If you can find its mother, and then you find a little girl that's maybe a year older, you've kind of come up with a date for when these people lived in that area and when this picture would have been taken. Let's start out from the very beginning. In 1840, here's the earliest surviving photograph of a woman. She's Dorothy Catherine Draper. Her brother was Dr. John William Draper, and he's the one that took this picture. The oldest photograph of the United States president was taken in 1843. This was President John Quincy Adams. He died about 5 years after this photograph was taken. I want you to notice there's books in the background. There's a table by him. Photography would prop things up so that would give a feeling of livingness. Do you have a photograph that you think you know? Compare it to Godey's Lady's Book online. Google is a wonderful source. Wonderful. If you go to the Library of Congress photo collection, look in the year you think it is and see if you can match pictures with various ones that they show. See how the hair looks. See how the dress looks. See how the background looks. You can use resource books. There's 100 years of hairstyles. You can buy this on Amazon.com. Hairstyles, 60 years by Maureen Taylor. She's a well-known hairstyle historian. So you'll find out what looks in 1840, what was worn in 1850, 1860, 1870, hair's getting longer, and 1880. I'm going to talk about that long hair later because there's an interesting story behind it. Newspapers. You can go and get newspapers from certain areas that have both photographs and sketches. They'll give you costumes. They'll give you ads. Wouldn't you like to buy a three-piece outfit? Just $1 down, and you've got 6 months to pay. But look at the skirt length. This is giving you an idea of what date that particular picture was taken. Or if you have a friend that's wearing the tailor-made walking bicycle suit, wouldn't that be cool? That's 1897. You can see all the ins and outs of that. Though to tell you the truth, I look at the ones on the right, I don't know how they could ride a bicycle with that. Wouldn't those skirts get in the way? Or you can get a picture like this, which is talking about a time period that you're probably aware of, the 1920s, and they're talking about New York and Paris. Realize fashion would go across from America to Europe and back again. It's just the way fashion goes. Let's start with the beginning photograph, which is a daguerreotype, 1840 to 1862. If you have a box and you have this in it, I'd be surprised. These didn't last too long. They were quite small, 2 3/4 by 3 inches, but they were extremely fragile. They were housed usually in cases like this to keep them from getting tarnished and abraded. In 1842, they cost between $2.50 and $6. It depends on what part of the country you lived in. Today, they'd run about $85 to $200. Now, that means there weren't too many of those taken. That was expensive. So that's why that you don't find as many out there in your collection. The next one that's of value to look at is the ambrotype. This one was 1854. This is 14 years after the first photographs were made available to people. These are also not very often found in family collections because even though they cost much less and they could be hand tinted in color, they were very, very, very fragile. They're almost always done as portraits, and they usually are put in the hinged case like that, but they're on glass, and so they break. Pretty bad. But they cost between 25 and 40 cents, and today that would be about $6. Not too bad. People could have those. if they lasted. Next on the list is the tin type. I mentioned that at the beginning. It is sometimes found in the family collections because it was definitely cheaper and more reproduced. They didn't use a negative. The emulsion was put right on that piece of tin. Now, those tin types are also not very, what can I say, could go through to the current time because they got scratched, they got corrosion on them, they just weren't as good as they could be. And they were usually quite a dark black with a poor image quality. However, their price was only 5 cents each. I guess you get what you pay for. It'd be about $1 today, but their size was pretty darn small. They were commonly found in the carte de vis size, which is about 2.5 by 4.25 inches. And they could even be produced in smaller sizes. They were claimed to be ready in 5 minutes. So for 5 cents and 5 minutes, you got a photograph on a piece of tin. And even the photographers could copy the older, the more fragile pictures for $2 a dozen. Man, they probably did a lot of those. Now we're going to get to some that might be in your collection of older photographs. This is called the carte de vis, the calling card. It was popular from 1863 to 79. The way it was produced, it was paper mounted on a card. And the common size was about 2.25 by 3.5 inches. The card was a little bigger. The cost, between 25 and 50 cents. Today, it would run you about $4 to $8. I'm showing you an album that has 4 of them. The ones on the right are the carte de vis. The one on the left, which is bigger, that's a cabinet card, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But let's talk a little bit about the carte de vis, because it is very popular and may be in your collection. It was very inexpensive. The way they would make it is they'd have 8 to 10 images on one plate, and they were either done with all of them the same picture, or the photographer, if he had the correct lens sequence, could take different poses. So he could have a set of 8 or 10 poses, or he can have just one. They cost between 25 and 50 cents each. And there was a 3-cent revenue tax that was put on the back, and it was designed to offset the cost of the Civil War. Now, that tax, which is on the back, has a date on it. So if you have one of these, look on the back and see if you have a date, so you can figure out the date of the photograph. The cost today, as I mentioned, would be between $4 to $8. And just to give you an idea, again, the size, 2.25 by 3.5. Here's one held in someone's hand, so you can see how big it was. It wasn't very big, was it? Why was it so popular? Well, it's a calling card. If you're familiar, we have one here of Napoleon III from 1859. If you're familiar with what would happen at a high society home, if you would go to visit, you're going to visit, you get to the door, they don't answer the door. The butler answers the door and say, yes, who am I, pardon me, who may I say is calling? And you give them a calling card that has your name on it. So the butler will take the card, and I'll say if Mrs. So-and-so is receiving today, and he'll go in and show it to the lady, and he says, are you receiving today? And she'll either say yes or no. If she is, he'll leave the card with her. He'll have the people come in and they'll go and talk to him. If she's not there, they keep the card. That lets them know these people came to call. We weren't here, but they made a visit. It's an interesting thing. But when the little carte de vis came out, they traded them as part of their calling cards. They gave them as visitors, and they also gave them to friends. These were made as what's called a contact print. The negative would be taken, and it would be sandwiched together, exposed under light. There was no enlarger needed, quick and dirty. However, they did have a solar enlarger, And they could make that little image into a big print, which was normally put on photographically sensitive canvas. And then it would be painted over with oils. So a person could have an heirloom portrait and not have to go through what would happen if you had a painter do your picture. You know how that would be? You'd have the painter, he'd have a sitting, he or she would paint you up to a certain extent and said, okay, we'll do another one of these in 2 months. And then they'd come back and they'd paint some more. So you'd be not wasting, but you'd be spending an awful lot of time having the painting done. Whereas with this enlargement, you got a nice painting, and it's probably closer to what you actually look like than what the painter did when they did their painting. Here's the cabinet card. This one could very likely be in your collection. They were larger. They were also a paper print that was mounted on a card. Photographers were trying to make money, so they would encourage their customers to buy lots of copies so they could share them with family and friends. Size about 4.5 by 6.5 inches. The card was usually about 5 inches by 7 inches. 1 dozen. They cost about $2 for just a dozen. Wow, yeah, let's give them out to all the friends. Nowadays, that would be $52 for those dozen cards. Still, not a bad price for a dozen. What's the difference between the cabinet card and the carta vista? Cabinet card was larger, and usually on the back, it had a big ad for the photographer. The cheap way to get his ads apart. But it was kind of cool because you could see where the photographer was from and all those good things. The carta vista, here it is, was about 2.25 by 3.25 inches. And it was put in little albums like that. They made specific albums just for the carta vista. There's also some things you can find that are border style changes. Photographers are always eager to do something different. So at the 1862 to 63, they had these little thin lines that went around the outside of the card. Somebody says, let's do something different. Let's do something better. Better was a thick line and then a thin line. Okay. All right, let's do something even better. We're going to have a real thick line, just the thick line, no thin line around. And then the picture put in there. They all jumped on the bandwagon. They also was different card stocks. At the beginning, they were what's called natural, which were sort of beigey. Then they had pastels and dark cards, both about 1888. And we get to almost the 20th century, we get the highly fashioned cards, which are more glossy. When you look at the pictures, they're mounted very shishi type. There's also some other tips. Sometimes they have a single artistic line. That's usually in the 1880s to the mid-90s. And 1895, the photographer not only wanted to put the ad on the back, he started to get really fancy with the front. He put a monogram, signature on the front. And even the card itself was scalloped. And before 1895, the scallops were uneven. After, they were symmetrical. Let's look at a photograph from 1850. Actually, there's 2 here. The one on the left is a family of 5 women. I'm assuming this is either a mother and 4 daughters or 5 sisters. It's painted. The person who did the painting was probably an artist, because you'll notice the clothing is well done. The shadows are well done. There's highlights in the woman's hair. Their flesh looks a good color. Everything seems to be quite well done. I would be pleased to have a photograph like this. I would think also there was a cost to painting each one of these people. At least I charge for that, right? On the right, you see a family from 1850 that is what I call lightly hand-colored, very lightly. The little boy has a little bit of red on his shirt, probably the same color that was used on the little girl's pink dress that isn't really completely colored. The mother has some rouge and the father has some rouge. The babies have some, and that's about it. There's no color to the hair. The flesh of the hands may be colored. It's a sepia to start out with. The dresses aren't colored. The jackets aren't colored. It's kind of disappointing if you think about it, but I would think they didn't charge as much for this. Take what you get. 1860, all of a sudden, full-length portraits were very popular. Ornate chairs were used. Walls in 1860, the early 1860s, had blank. They weren't very much to them, but there were patterned floors. Well, they decided, let's get something a little fancy. Let's treat around the picture. We get a painted background. So here we have a painted background. Floor is still patterned. The wall, the chairs, the drapes, the coverings on the floor can help you to date the photograph. 1870, the lenses got it better. In 1877, they got a lot of full bust portraits. And those didn't need a whole bunch of stuff behind them. So the backgrounds became less busy. They didn't have to put them in if they got that close. 1860, the plain backgrounds, as I was talking, were usually with a drape, a chair. You might have a table with books. If this man was a minister, he might have a Bible there to give you an idea of what his occupation was. Children were posed standing on a chair. I've got to keep them occupied. Or leaning against the table, or being held up by a mother, or grabbing onto the side of the chair to keep them anchored. And if they were babes in arms, but they weren't in arms, they were tied to a chair with a sash to keep them upright. Now, I've looked at this picture that I got off the internet to give you as an example, and I'm almost sure that black area you see behind the baby and extending over to the right, that's mama. She's got her hand back there to make sure that baby doesn't fall off. And the photographer did a little photoshopping, which they didn't have photoshopping in those days, but probably did some oiling on that background to get rid of the mom's body. Now, if I was taking a picture of a baby in that position, I would have the mother right by it. I wouldn't allow that baby to fall on the floor. Think of the lawsuit. Studios and backgrounds, early 1860. I'm reiterating, they were simple. They had drapes, they had columns, chairs, simple walls, patterned floors, though. They started to get the painted backgrounds, and they started to paint the pictures in the mid-60s. This one fascinates me because if you look at the floor, I'm sure that's a patterned floor, but the person who did the painting on this just sort of brushed over it, so it really doesn't show too well. You can see a little suspicion of it underneath. The other thing that fascinated me about this picture is when I looked at it, I looked at the mirror. The lady in the mirror does not have the same color as the lady that has the dress that's standing in front. I'm wondering what happened. Did the photographer forgot to tell the photo artist to paint that part? Did she just leave it, think the mirror didn't reflect, but she's got the face a color and she's got the hair a color? Interesting idea. Sometimes things get left out. In 1870, I mentioned that the lenses were better. Close-up pictures and oval matted images became popular. So if you have an oval mat on your picture, you're going to think, yeah, it's about 1870. 1880, we started to go back to elaborate studio sitting with a painted background. We've got fences, we've got rocks, we've got fake everything. Kid's got a badminton racket, and on the bottom, he's got a badminton, what do they call them, shuttlecock? All interesting. One of the things you may want to think about, if a woman is seated, it's harder to date because her dress is difficult to see properly in a silhouette. If she's standing like this lady here, you can see, yes, she has a bustle. Yes, she has fringes on her dress. Yes, she has this. Yes, she has that. So this gives you a clue as to what time period it's taken. I always get a laugh when I look at this one. This is called a plinth. A plinth is a prop. It was very common, and it still is common. I use things like this in my studio. We used it for men, or they used it for women. Now this one, she's not leaning on it, but she's using it to guide her hand. And to tell you the truth, most of the reason that these are used is to have a place for the hand to go. If you've ever seen a photograph of a man, for example, and he's standing, he's dead in camera, and his hands are just hanging down, not a really nice picture. This one has a place for him to put his elbow. His hand falls very gracefully. It gives you a feeling of he's comfortable. The lady the same. The one that isn't leaning on anything, she still is holding on to something with her hand, and the other hand, the photographer has wisely put something in it. So she has something to do with her hands. You wouldn't expect her to fold her hands over her chest, put it behind her head. Where's she going to put her hand? That's something that you make a sitter or a standee comfortable with, is to put their hands where they can feel comfortable. 1870, we had a national detective agency, and they were doing photographs then. Now, I hope you don't find a mugshot of your relatives in your box. Oh, yeah. I have one in mind. This gentleman is my uncle, my husband's uncle. He was in prison, age 26, in 1913. Prisons took pictures too. In fact, I do have some other photographs of him, because what they would do is they take him without his hat and they take him with his hat. He was in for manslaughter. He got out in 2 years later. He was justified, because she was unfaithful. He killed his wife. He married my husband's aunt, and they lived happily for a long time. I never knew until after he died that he had been in prison. 1870, the hoops were starting to get flatter. So the bustle was born. So if you see a picture with a bustle, you're looking at 1870. Here was the dome shape that was previous to it. You can see she definitely has a bustle. Hairstyles were changing too. Prior to this time, most of the hairstyles were parted in the center. Even Louisa May Alcott was parted right in that center. All of a sudden, we got fringe bangs coming out. We have longer hair. We have things being put in hair. We've got flowers. We've got, barrettes. We've got combs. You name it. And we'll talk about hair a little bit more because that's an interesting topic. 1870 were also popular for seated poses, half-length poses. But full length were still popular because how else could you show off that beautiful train? The painted backgrounds came into existence as well, even though some of the others were plain. When you got to have something outdoors, you got a painted background and all kinds of things you could sit on, you could put your hand on. This one, I feel like the trees are attacking this poor guy. I don't know. I hope I don't find a forest that looks like that. It looks like something out of, I don't know when. But 1870, you see a lot of photographs like that. But the cameo window is also where you see a lot of the 1870 images. These two, I'm venturing to guess, since I don't have them in my hand, that the picture itself was cut into that oval sequence. This one, I believe, was done, the picture is still rectangular, but a matting with the oval was put over it. Doesn't matter, it still has the cameo window. As I was talking before, the painted background became more dramatic with props in 1880. I want you to look at this young lady who is resting her hand on the furniture. Her left hand's on the furniture, her right hand is away from her body slightly, holding a handkerchief. You can see what a lovely waist she's got. They squeeze themselves into those outfits. Sometimes they can hardly breathe. The girl on the left, if you look at her, she's got the same kind of a dress. She doesn't have gloves on, but she has her hand looped over the front of her body. Now that might be an appropriate photograph pose if she was pregnant. I don't think she is. I just think that's where she put her hands because she felt comfortable. She would have looked nicer for the photograph if she'd taken her right hand, put it on the table, taken the left hand and maybe hold the kerchief in it, bring it back so we could see she has that nice thin waist that everybody wanted. Well, too bad, Mr. Photographer, you didn't do a good job. I want to share this one with you because this is a little boy. Now, at this time period, little boys wore dresses, had long hair, wore even hats that little girls might wear. You know, diapering a child at this age, and he's wearing pants, is not an easy thing to do. And that's why most of them wore dresses at that time period. The interesting thing about this little boy, it's Franklin Roosevelt as a child. Just thought you'd be interested in that. 1890, again, the lenses were getting better, and those close-up portraits were happening some more. The vignette became popular. This is very typical of the 1890s. What happens is the photographer has the person on a light background. And when they're printing the image, they hold back the area around the actual person and softly let it soften into the background. You can see this a little clearer with this gentleman. He has a slightly darker background, which shows up a little more. This one I call is not as good of a vignette because it's not really an oval, it's sort of an A-shaped actually. I would have redone this one if I had printed it. I used to do vignettes. Vignettes were popular also in the early years of photography. As a general rule, you might find if the camera is closer to the sitter, the photograph is later in date because as the lenses got better, the photographers were able to get in closer and show all the little problems on your face. One of the things you can do is Google things like 1890 women's headdresses and hairstyles. There's several of these things on the internet that you can pull up and look. This is an excellent one because not only does it show you a hairstyle, it shows you the hat they might have worn. And if you look, it'll even show you the type of neckline they might have. So if you have a picture that looks like one of these, well, you're pretty good. You're close to getting the time period. Men, I hate to talk about men, but men can be deceptive because they didn't change too much. Maybe their hat got a little taller or a little shorter. Though I've got to say, whoever did this 1890 men's hairstyle graphic was very inventive with the gentleman they put up at the upper row, right in the center with the bright blue shirt and that Irish hat and the beard and the pipe. I don't know. Do you think guys walked around like that in those days? They may have. But some of the mustaches are some things people would have now. Some of the jackets, men didn't change their clothes that much. Some of the ties are what people wear now for ties. So don't use men as a way to gauge for your dating. This is the other thing I feel is deceptive. They say examples of the sleeve in the period from 1890 to 1898. And it says check to establish the date. Well, to tell you the truth, I'm looking at two of them here that say 1892 and 1892. They don't look that much the same, do they? And the one that's 1893 to 1894, it looks like maybe it's got an inch more of fluff in it. So I would say don't use that as the be-all and end-all to judge. Clothes can give you a clue, but it doesn't always work that way. I've come across this when I was doing the research, and I thought I'd share it with you. This is called the hidden hand. In the 1750s, this is before photography, the painters were using this to indicate leadership. So they'd have them put their hand in their clothing. Well, photographers glommed onto this, and I'll tell you why. If he put his hand in his jacket, that would prevent blurring. So he wouldn't be raising his hand and waving it and it would blur. So he got it anchored. You may find That's used a lot in military portraits, both in paintings, sketches, and in photographs. Now, I told you I'd talk about hair. Victorian ladies didn't cut their hair. They liked long, Rapunzel-like hair. Why? Because it was a sign of social status. Why would that be? Well, can you just imagine a woman like this washing clothes, setting the table, cooking? No. How long do you think it would take her to wash and dry that hair? Brush it out. Long, well-groomed hair was a privilege. It was only for the middle and upper classes. So if you had long hair like that, you wanted to sprout it off, but it took a long time. You had to have servants, and that meant you had money. But even though you had that hair, you also were careful about not showing it, because letting your hair down was seen as wild. It was reserved for models, actresses, and probably mistresses. However, that didn't stop parling for the hair to come out, the hair producer and restorer. It claimed it would prevent your hair falling off and turning gray. Now, I'm sure women were really, I want to get that stuff. I don't want my hair to fall off or turn gray. Well, it wasn't a one-trick pony, though. It also promoted the growth of the beard and mustache for men. And far be it to keep it away from children. Why neglect your children's hair? It has a three-way market right there. And why am I talking about this? Well, I'm going to talk about the Sutherland sisters. You may have heard of them. There were 7 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And a brother, Sutherland brother. The Sutherland sisters were singers. So they fell into that actress category. They could let their hair down. And that's what they did when they sang in the public in the 1880s. They would sing and they would let their hair down. Now, the parents noticed that people liked their singing voice, but they made a lot of comments when the hair was down, all 37 feet of it. Yeah, about 5.5 feet a girl. Now, Dad was pretty savvy about things, and he decided he was going to take advantage of this. And he came out with the Sutherland sisters hair grower, the greatest hair tonic on earth. Yeah. He shows a man with no hair, and then after using it, this guy's got hair. But he does mention he's the father of the 7, note 'em, 7 Sutherland, 7 sisters. And he had his own private bottle made up with the Sutherland sisters logo on it. This was examined later and discovered that it was just alcohol. Yeah, isn't that a shame? I mean, what can you say? But he made a lot of money with this. The guy wasn't stupid. He was Reverend Fletcher Sutherland, too. Wow. Now, I'm going to talk about something a little sad, and I hope you might have a picture like this in your collection. You may not even realize you do. This is a family portrait with a deceased child. You know, in the days of this, when the child had died, that was the last you had. The baby was put in a box, was gone into the cemetery. You didn't have anything else. So this is a remembrance of the child. This is a family group. You wouldn't get that family group any other way, but just that way. They would take the young ones too. They were so sad. They would try to take them so that you could remember them nicely. They would take them with their brothers and sisters. They would take them by themselves, propped up, laying in a casket, laying on a chair, and even when an older child would die, Mom and Dad would have a picture taken with them. Mothers would hold their deceased children, and usually they'd have a material over their face. This one is kind of interesting. If you look at the little boy and the little girl, the little boy says, well, I don't want to be here. The little girl isn't too anxious about it either. But we've got mother with the veiling over her face. Here's another one with veiling over her face. And another one. This one was quite creative. If you'll notice, it looks like she took the background and put it over herself to hide herself. Remember this in a few moments because we'll talk about the over the face veiling. Older people are often photographed in death as well. We have here, this looks like the Addams family to me every time I look at it. We've got two young men on the side, it's probably his son. We've got a daughter, I assume, a mother, a wife, who's the mother of the child, and then he's in his casket. I'm sure they're at the cemetery. This lady looks like she's taken within her home. Photographer went into the house. They said, Maud's dead. We want a picture of her, and they did that. This one, I venture to guess, was taken in, not the photographer's studio. I think it was taken at the funeral home. The funeral home might have had what they call a fainting couch that they could put one of their guests on. The photographer would come in and take the picture. Now, this isn't too unusual, to tell you the truth. About 40 years ago, I told you I've been in photography for a long time. We had a call to the studio. They wanted my husband to go to the funeral home and take a picture of a man in the casket. They said, we've never had a photograph of him before. We need a photograph before he's put in the ground. So my husband went, took the picture, came back. We gave them what they wanted. We also had a family group that we did a lot of photographs for. And one day we got a phone call. The dad had died. They said, please come down to the funeral home. We want a family group picture. So we went to the funeral home. It was an open casket. His wife held his hand. His daughters, his sons, his grandchildren were all around. We did the photograph. I was with my husband at the time. And he said to me after, he said, I can't say to them, everybody smile. This was not something you wanted to do. So, things happen. You have to pick and choose. But it was something special. I've even photographed a funeral as if it was like a wedding. I have a scary thing. Some of the Filipinos like to have pictures to prove that their deceased were taken care of properly and had a religious ceremony. I had one that wasn't, it might have been Filipino. It was kind of spooky because they had three ladies that were dressed like angels. The casket was brought up to the front of the church, and the ladies went up to the casket, and they'd say, Corpus, Corpus, Corpus. And I'm thinking to myself, what the? Corpus is Latin for body. But no, this was the man's name. Well, he didn't rise up, luckily, and we went on with the service. But I have the feeling this is part of a service because they want to make sure the person is really dead. Remember, you talked about the bells they put over coffins? Because sometimes people would be put in coffins and they were still alive. Gave them a chance to come back to life for you. Remember, I talked about the mothers that had the veil over their faces? Here's a lady who has a veil, and she has an empty chair. Deducing this is a widow. Usually, the empty chair means loss and grief. Here we have a lady in mourning costume. If you have a picture like this, look at what she's wearing. That means there's been a death in her family. That might help you to figure out a date. And those clothes were universal. They were all dark, and they wore them for a specific length of time. In fact, I was at a Portuguese wedding one time, and there was a lady that was wearing this dress. And I said something to one of the ladies. I said, well, what's with her? She says, oh, she's a widow. She's worn that dress for 20 years, that same dress. Well, I don't know. I hope she washed it. Yeah, they wore that. There was usually a year, I believe, they could have to keep themselves in black after a widow. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't get remarried. They weren't supposed to anyway. it was showing reverence for the deceased. Oh, let's talk about circus people. I found, yeah, these are great. There's a photographer called Charles Eisman. He photographed thousands of these people. Why did he photograph them? Well, think about a little. See the gentleman here? He doesn't have any legs. What could he do to make money? This guy here, look how small he is. What could he do to make money? Well, they send these pictures to the circus, to the carnival, and they say, hey, this is what I look like. How about putting me in your show? This poor guy, I think he's JoJo. The lady on the end, that is Annie Jones. She's the bearded lady. She was born with a disease called hirsutism. I can't even say it, but she was stuck with it. When she was 1 year old, they had her in Barnum's American Museum. Did so well, Barnum gave her $150 a week for a 3-year contract. She passed away at the age of 37 from tuberculosis. Pretty sad. Didn't last that long. This woman, I have to talk about this one because I first saw this picture in a book of photographs and it didn't have any explanation. I said, well, what the heck is that? I looked at it. And I said, is it a doll? She's holding it in her lap. That's got the same clothes she's got on. No, I can't find a doll there. Well, it turns out this is the four-legged girl. And she was really four-legged. It wasn't a trick. She was born in 1868. She has two torsos. So as you're looking at this picture, the leg that's the bigger one on the left and the one next to it, they go together. The leg that's the bigger one on the right and the little one, they go together. She's got two torsos. Her parents got her in a sideshow at age 13. Poor girl, she couldn't walk. Can you imagine? Those two outer legs didn't work too well because they weren't the same body. She did get married at age 19. She had 4 daughters and a son, 5 children. The scary thing is when she died, when she was 58, they had to cover her casket in concrete because grave robbers were trying to steal the corpse. Isn't that scary? Poor woman. Let's get to some years that we can look at. 1900. 1900 is kind of a stop period. Things started to happen because shoes started to be shown. Clothes were loose. Well, if you think about it, it used to be you weren't supposed to see the woman's ankles. Clothes went clear down to the floor. You weren't. It was risque to see an ankle. So the hemline started to raise. Shoes were starting to show, so you could look at feet and use those as a barometer for a time period. Also, cars came out in 1900. Photographers just leaped on the bandwagon, and they had cars. They had cars. They had cars. And they had cars. Not only for adults, but even kids. Wow, I bet those kids just felt like they were in dreamland getting on a car. These, of course, were all props in the studio. They weren't the actual cars. And also popular at this time were bicycles. Photographers would have bicycles as props in their studio. Or their fitting would come in with their own bicycle. I'm pretty sure the photographer didn't have that one in his studio. That probably belonged to the gentleman who's posing so nicely by it. And then, oh, if you haven't seen this movie from 1902, Google it, go and see it. This is called A Trip to the Moon. It's a silent movie, but it was out in 1902, the first science fiction film of all time. Oh my gosh, it was so popular, so popular. And the photographer said, oh my gosh, let's do this. So they put people on the moon, all kinds of people on the moon. There's that little girl I showed you earlier. Here she is on the moon. And we have Alfred Miller and James Oberg. They nicely put their names and a date on their picture on the moon. They took families on the moon. They have a little seat for them to sit on the moon. Man, they did a lot. So if you have a photograph like this, you got a good idea when it was taken. Not only does the lady's hat give you a clue with the clothing, but that moon, it's something else. 1900, also wedding photographs. Wedding photographs were usually done in the studio, not at the church, as is normally done. Well, I don't know if it's normally done now, but it's usually done now. I did a lot of wedding portraits over the years. I had 50 years of wedding negatives, 50 years of them. There were a lot of pictures. Anyways, if you look here, you can see the background is fairly plain because you are accenting the bride and the groom in this state. Here we have a wedding party. We've got the gentleman seated, the guy behind. I'm assuming the lady on the right is the bride. This is the maid of honor. This is the best man. Sometimes you'd have a whole family group, or rather a whole wedding party group. And some photographers could take that because their studios were big enough, some weren't. And then we have here a fairly plain background. The gal is sitting, the bride's sitting, and she's got, looks like the basket on the floor from perhaps the flower girl and the flowers from one of the bridesmaids. If you'll notice, the two portraits to start out with were standing, with the women standing, the guy sitting. This one, the guy is standing, the girl sitting. Well, the advantage of having the woman stand is not so the guy can look like the king of the hill. It's because her dress shows much better when she's standing. She can show how nice her waist is. She can show how pretty that money that she put into her dress shows. Whereas when she's sitting, the veil just cascades down and gets into a little puddle at the feet. It's not as pretty. And you can't really see her waistline. Now, maybe she doesn't want to show you her waistline. Maybe that's why she's sitting. But she really looks better standing. That's always a thing to think about. We're in 1910 now. When we're in 1910, the World War broke out. World changed. Fashion changed. Not only that, women were out there looking for the votes. They were walking around. They were working too. The men went over to the war. The women had to take their spots. Suffrage movements and higher dress hem. We have now a total different view of shoes. Didn't it? Yeah, that's different. And hats, going from tip of the toes to tip of the hat. In 1910, the hats were literally gigantic. Gigantic. I would think that the flying nun would be very envious of these hats. In 1914, the United States says, okay, if you got a passport, you have to have your picture taken. And in this time period, you were able to have your picture taken with your child. So you didn't have to get a separate passport for the child. And about 50 years ago, when I was taking passports, I'm still taking passports, but when I was taking passports, we did take the family. We took usually the mom, the dad, and the kids all together for a passport. It was okay to do that. Well, all of a sudden, it wasn't okay to do that. The picture had to be of the child alone, which can be a challenge if you have a child that's like 2 months old. Doesn't hold its head up very much. And you have to have them straight into camera. You have to show both. I mean, anyway. This particular one was September the 11th, 1914. I went a little further to find out what passports looked as you continued. And in 1926, it became actually a booklet like we have now. This is Sarah Irene Logan, and this is her passport. And I went in a little further, and I found out in 1943, Rita Hayworth had a passport. Now, if you have a passport now, or you've taken one recently, you're going to find it's a little different even than it has been. My daughter's husband just got his passport back. I did his passport picture for him. They're putting them in color. and black and white. And the black and white has little swirlies through it. And the pages that the pictures and your signature are now more plasticized. Oh, and plus, the images are all digital now. And didn't you know it? You can send your own selfie in for a passport now. I can't believe it. Let's get to an image that I just worked on. This was a 1914 image. It was brought to me by one of my clients. It was about 3 by 4 inches in size and rather not in too good a condition. You could still see things. I did some restoration and I colored it. And it comes out like that. Now, I feel this gives you a better rendition of what the picture looks like. I'm sure my client will enjoy it. I really got a little tickle out of the guy's hair, the dad's hair. He has 2 little streams of hair in the front, almost like little mustaches across the top of his head, and it goes bald to the back. But he has hair. It wasn't until I got to work on this that I discovered the little girl was holding something in her lap, a little animal of some type. I don't think it's a cat. At first I thought it was a cat. I think it's a toy, but it doesn't matter. It's something I wouldn't have noticed until I started to work on it. I'm hopeful my client will enjoy this. I haven't delivered it to him yet. But that's the thing I would like you to think about. If you have some photographs that are in bad condition, some of them can be fixed. If they should be doing something like silvering out, and if you may know what that looks like, if you take the print, black and white I'm talking about, and you rotate it a little bit and you see a sheen on it, that means that the silver is still in the image and it's fading out your image. Get it copied because it is going to fade away. If it's been in contact with corrugated paper, it will fade away. It will get corrugated spots on it too, because corrugated paper isn't archival. If you really want to keep a photograph, get it copied. Let's get to the 1920s. I was fascinated when I started to research this one because a lady called Florence Arnold says, my sister was a flapper. She wore short dresses, fur coat, and of course, galoshes. Galoshes, I didn't think about that. But yes, the term flapper, the shoes flap and flap and flap. And that's how it got the name. I thought it was because their skirts flapped. No, the shoes were flapping. The war was over. We have a tide of change. And all of a sudden, we had the short hair, the short skirts. We had risque shoes. We were going to live it up, man. I don't know what they consider risque shoes, but I guess it's ones that have like cutouts on them. Looking at the shoes they show as an example. Now, who can deny that these are from 1920? The hair, the expression, the poses. Man, you can tell those are 1920. Let's recap just a few interesting facts. 1850, I'm showing you a rather battered tintype. 1860, we have adults that are usually photographed standing. 1870, we have the cameo opening. 1880, those Sutherland sisters with the hair and the hair restorer. We had the 1888 dark and light cardstock. And even in 1890, a distinguishing feature, vignettes on the picture. Fascinating to me. But let's talk about something that changed photography totally. This is the Kodak Brownie camera. One of you might have had one of these at some time. It was introduced in 1900 for $1. This was the $1 Brownie box camera. They had a huge advertising campaign. Kodak and Brownie cameras helped make the Christmas merry. Look at it. Yeah, Kodak. You know why they had the cameras? They had to sell cameras. They had a lot of film. They had the film and they wanted to sell the film. But how can you sell film if you don't have cameras? And guess who they marketed to? Children. The Brownie camera was designed for children. Their ads talked about it. They even show, this one is precious. The little girl is saying, well, I see how, Papa. It isn't a bit hard. And it says, of course, it's easy. Even the littlest child can take good pictures with a brownie. Well, their campaign was pretty successful. 150,000 brownie cameras were sold in the first year of production. And going even further, it made photography that was accessible to the public. You didn't have to go to a photographer anymore. You could take your own. Maybe you'd go to a photographer for formal portraits, but boy, if you wanted to take pictures on your doorstep, you could do it anytime you wanted. Here's the little girl. This isn't the brownie, but it's a version of it with the lenses on. This little girl has a brownie. That's definitely what they were selling. And this little boy is the boy with the brownie. And the slogan says, it works like a Kodak. Now, Kodak is a made-up name. So I'm not sure what that meant, but it meant something to somebody. I love this ad. This is great because it's really hidden it. Any schoolboy or girl can make good pictures with one of the Kodak brownie cameras for a whole $1. And if you read the fine print down below, not only could you buy the camera, you could get the container that you could put film in. You could get the film. That's what they're trying to sell. The film would hold 6 exposures that are approximately 2.5 by 2.5 in size. Little tiny pictures. Little tiny ones, but they still were pictures. Not only that, you could get the developing and printing system, all for a mere 75 cents. Wow. You've taken it away from the photographers. Man, forget that. If you have some of these pictures, you're going to know where they came from. And they're little, real little. It wasn't until later photographers said, hey, they're too small. We'll big pictures for you. Give us the negatives and we'll make them bigger up to a certain size. Well, I've come to the end of my presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it. I know I enjoyed putting it together. If you're ready, you can find out when some of your photographs were taken by using some of the clues I've given you. They're not all perfect clues, but they give you something to start with. Sometimes you're going to be surprised. You'll say, oh, I didn't know it was taken then. And sometimes you're really going to get that home run and you say, oh, I was hoping to find this out. Now I know that's when it was taken. It's in a cameo, so it was taken in 1870. But whatever you do, once you're learning, you're going to find it's fun. And it's a lot of fun being a detective. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it.